to introduce Valentin Andronache from the University of Catholic University of Leuven to speak to us on piecing together fragments of tradition and following the alterations of John 14:25 to 26 in early Greek authors.
Thank you. To share my screen. I hope you can see it now.
Yes, thanks. That's great.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to present at this colloquium. In this presentation, I have tried to put together a few fragments of interpretation, not manuscript, by looking at the text of John 14:25-26 and its interpretations in a few early Greek Christian authors. With this presentation, I intend to offer an overview of my doctoral project in which I studied the history of exegesis of this Johannine passage. I would like to mention as a disclaimer that since I'm only at the beginning of my research, I will give this presentation more in terms of questions, hypotheses, and expectations. In my project, I'm concerned with the reception of John 14:25-26, the so-called Second Paraclete Saying, in the works of Greek and Latin writers from the first millennium. The research question that guides my study is twofold. Firstly, I inquire what interpretations the early Christian authors gave to the Second Paraclete Saying, or what this saying meant for them. And secondly, I examine how all these interpretations came about, what influenced the early authors' exegesis. In other words, I want to find out whether any of these three factors, the form of the biblical text, the exegetical methods used, and the theological and historical context, have influenced the exegesis of the Second Paraclete Saying, and if so, which ones and to what extent. For the purpose of this presentation, I will focus on the relationship between the form of the text and the exegesis of the Second Paraclete Saying, giving a few examples from the 4th century. I must say that when I began my investigations, I expected to find a clear connection between the text of John, its variants, and the different interpretations, but my initial findings do not really play along with my expectations. Before looking at the examples, let us remind what John 14:25-26 says. According to the translation of NRSV, it reads, "I have said these things to you while I am still with you, but the Advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you everything and remind you of all that I have said to you." One of the main topics of this passage refers to the teaching activity of the Paraclete, which has been understood both by the patristic authors and modern scholars in two ways, either being limited to what Jesus taught during his earthly ministry or going beyond Jesus' teaching. The following examples will comment on this issue. I'm using in this presentation the text of Nestle Island 28 as a sort of gauge for highlighting the variations in the patristic citations of the Second Paraclete Saying. However, I am aware that these authors throughout their lives possessed different manuscripts of the Bible and probably manuscripts from different geographical centers with different kinds of texts. The first example comes from Eusebius of Caesarea, who quotes this passage in his De Ecclesiastica Theologia, and we see that there are a few small variants. There is a genitive pronoun mu following hopater in verse 26c. The relative pronoun ha is replaced with hosa in verse 26a, and humin ego is missing from Eusebius' text. It is unlikely that these changes influenced Eusebius in the position he takes regarding the Paraclete's teaching function, about which he says that it completes the teaching of Jesus. Yet, Eusebius is quoting the Second Paraclete Saying in a chapter in which he insists on the distinction between the Spirit and the Son. And so he probably gives this interpretation because if the Paraclete has a teaching function that completes Jesus' teaching, the distinction between the two is strengthened. The second example comes from Cyril of Jerusalem, who quotes, partially though, and interprets the Second Paraclete Saying in his 16th baptismal catechesis. But we know the form in which he knew the entire passage because he quotes it entirely in the 17th catechesis. Again, just a few small variants. In verse 26e, Cyril is missing ego in both of his quotations. In the 16th catechesis, he replaces ha with hosa. And in the 17th catechesis, there is an inversion between humas and didaxe. With respect to the Paraclete's teaching function, Cyril insists that what the Spirit teaches is the same with what Christ taught. It is unlikely that the form of the text has influenced Cyril's interpretation, because the text is almost identical with that of Eusebius. Yet, if we consider the audience of Cyril's writing, namely people coming for baptism, it looks like he chose this interpretation in order to protect the initiates from the temptation of following new teachings of those who claimed to be inspired by the Holy Spirit. The third example comes from Basil of Caesarea, who refers to the Second Paraclete Saying 8 times in his writings, but he quotes it only once in his treaty against Eunomius. The text is quoted partially, but for the part that is quoted, the text does not present any variations. Now, about the Paraclete's teaching function, Basil is a bit ambiguous. He only says that the Spirit has a teaching function, like Jesus, but what he teaches, whether the same things as Jesus or more, Basil does not say. The question is whether the form of the text influenced Basil's interpretation. Given the fact that Eunomius was a pneumatomachian, and that in the section where Basil quotes the Second Paraclete Saying, he argues that the Spirit needs to be placed on the same level with the Son, both in terms of nature and activity, I am rather inclined to believe that the parts that are missing were left out intentionally, because they have the power to depict the Paraclete in subordination to Jesus. Consider the phrase ento onomatimu. The fact that the Paraclete is sent in the name of Jesus already carries a sense of subordination. Now, to summarize and to offer an answer to my initial question, whether the form of the text influences the interpretation of the passage, based on the examples that we saw, this does not seem to be the case. Although Eusebius and Cyril have a similar text of the Second Paraclete Saying, they give different, or rather opposite, interpretations, which are influenced by the purpose of the writings where they are given. And the example of Basil shows, if my reading of him is correct, that actually the purpose of the interpretation influenced the form of the text and not the other way around, as I was expecting. As I said in the beginning, I'm just starting my research and there is a lot of evidence to be studied. So far, I have gathered 117 references to the Second Paraclete Saying in the patristic writings, and this is only up to the 7th century. I hope to find out more about the relation between the form of the biblical text and the exegesis of this passage in my study. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Valentin, for introducing that to us. I've got one notification already in the chat of a question. So Jeff, over to you, straight away.
Thanks, Hugh, and thanks, Valentin, for your paper. Your influences and background questions are all orthodox, but I wonder what the impact is on this particular text of one especially well-known heresy, that is that Mani claimed to be the Paraclete. And that would seem to me to have potential for influencing the choice of text and the way in which the text was presented.
Thank you for your question. I haven't looked specifically at these authors who are dealing with the problem of Mani, who claims to be the Paraclete, but I am aware of that, and I will be looking into it. And yes, I will consider also traditions that were deemed later not to be orthodox or mainstream.
Great, thank you. Any other observations or questions from people at this point in the proceedings? Certainly, I think it's a great thing to start from what the text is, and observe what the form in which this passage is quoted, because there's a danger that people can assume, or it can be presented as if a father chose a particular text out of all of the options on view. And I think that can often be a very misleading way to go about it, because simply because we have lots of variants visible in the apparatus of our modern critical editions, it doesn't mean that there was necessarily the same freedom to pick any reading you wanted when you came to exegesis in the early church. So I think that your focus on looking at the exact forms of text is helpful. At the same time, of course, there may be variations in the textual tradition of individual Christian writings, which are worth taking into consideration as well.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you again, Valentin. I shall stop the recording there.